Good morning, everyone. The U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. This morning, we are here to consider the nomination of Michael G. Whitaker to be the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. I want to thank Mr. Whitaker for his willingness to serve. I'm also grateful that the House Chairman, House Chairman Sam Graves is here, and we will hear from you soon. Chairman Graves, along with my colleague, Ranking Member Larson, have worked hard on a bipartisan bill to pass a long-term FAA reauthorization, so we thank you for that. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do the same here in a bipartisan fashion and finalize a bill into law before the end of 2023. This is a reminder that the aviation safety and the job of running the FAA are not partisan endeavors. They are ensuring strong leadership at the top of America's chief aviation regulator, and this should be our common goal. Mr. Whitaker's nomination has attracted broad support, not only from across the aisle, but from across the aviation community. He's supported by the aviation workforce, pilots, flight attendants, machinists, and engineers, and enjoys a broad support from many in the private sector of aviation. This foundation of support will serve well because the FAA administrator has a big job. Over 44,000 workers across multiple lines of business, from airports to air traffic control to aviation safety. And each day, they help keep Americans moving safely. 25,000 U.S. airline flights carrying 2.5 million passengers across the country and around the world. Today, he will come before the committee with more than 30 years of diverse experience in aviation, including executive leadership in the private sector and 3 years serving as FAA Deputy Administrator. He led the FAA's modernization of the National Airspace System, known shorthand as NextGen, and I hope he will be able to illuminate today the progress that we've made, important milestones that we've achieved, and what we need to do to get it finally implemented. Mr. Whitaker will bring a commitment to advancing aviation safety and appreciate his support by families who have lost loved ones and who have been very dedicated to improving aviation safety. But there are challenges that remain. America's aviation system is under stress, demonstrated by the number of near misses and close calls. We need to hear today about a plan on how to tackle those safety issues across our skies. The FAA's workforce has changed and will continue to do so over the next several years, and we look forward to learning how he will be able to build a strong safety culture, attract new talent, and renew leadership at the FAA. And like its workforce, FAA safety systems and technology must also be upgraded to 21st century innovations. And if confirmed, he will have the opportunity to lead the NAS modernization into the next era and telling us exactly how to get that done. To be the world leader in aviation, the United States must be a strong voice for safety at the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. You have over 30 years of experience in aviation, including executive roles on these important international issues, and we hope that your leadership will help the world community continue its safety focus. We need to learn how the FAA will effectively raise the global safety bar on pilot training and human factors. The families of the 737 MAX tragedies were critical in helping Congress pass important legislation, the Aircraft Certification, Safety, and Accountability Act. They support your nomination, as I mentioned, and we expect an understanding this morning on how you're going to carry out the further implementation of these critical safety reforms. The American public deserves a safe, reliable, effective air transportation system. Our economy depends on it, and if confirmed, you'll have the opportunity not only to lead the FAA, but shape America's future of aviation along with NASA. These are challenging times, but the aviation community and the leadership across many spectrums have the ability to get this job done and get it done correctly. So I welcome and thank you for your willingness to serve and take that leadership role in helping us. I now I'm waiting my colleague who had to run to Judiciary, so I'm going to allow our colleague, Senator Welsh, to make an opening statement, and then I'll turn to Representative Graves.
Madam Chair, you gave an excellent presentation of Mr. Whitaker's experience, but you left out one very important fact. He's my neighbor, lives down the dirt road. You go down Bragg Hill and up over Little Dinsmore Hill and take a little left, and there they are on the same dirt road right down the street in Vermont. So it's wonderful to have Michael here, Mary and Joe. You did outline his public experience, his private experience, and I was going to do that, but you've done it so well that I don't think we need to add to it. But I do want to say a couple of things. With this extraordinary experience he has, first as a pilot, a lifelong pilot, and with that, a constant concern about safety because he's had people he loves in his own plane. With his experience at the FAA, where you have this huge, important agency, and he had the responsibility to make it work in the implementation of a very important program that you mentioned. And then with his experience in the private sector, with United Airlines and the very responsible big jobs he had there, how can you have more experience in every phase of what's required to have our flight systems be safe, to have performance be solid, and to have the managerial experience to kind of create the team and the culture that's necessary for a well-functioning FAA. It's something that he and I spoke about at Dan & Witt's, which is a store where if you don't have it, you don't need it. That's the Norwich famous country store. So that broad depth of experience in that decision, and this is what I also really appreciate. At a time in his life when he was doing fine, he lives on a nice place that Bragg Hill, anyone wants to come and see it, it's a nice place. He wanted to serve, and we so need that in this country, to have people with the benefit of a lifelong career in the public and private sector deciding, you know what, I want to serve. So that gives me just immense confidence that we're going to have a tremendous director, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Welsh. Thank you for that very personal view of the nominee, and good to know that that road might come in handy sometime for some message delivery. Representative Graves, welcome before the committee. Thank you so much. Unless Senator Moran, did you want to, as the subcommittee chair, make a statement? Thank you. Representative Graves, thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. There's a lot of familiar faces on this committee, and I like that. And I also very much appreciate the opportunity. It is an honor to be here today to support Michael Whitaker for Administrator to the Federal Aviation Administration. And this is a crucial time for aviation and for the FAA. Steadfast leadership at the FAA is paramount if we as a nation are to remain the global leader in aviation safety and innovation, a goal that I know this committee and the nominee unequivocally support. It's been a year and a half since the previous administrator, Steve Dixon, stepped down. And if you think about it, safety is dependent on consistency. And unfortunately, the only thing that has been consistent at the agency since the former administrator departed is the growing list of acting positions across the agency. 18 months without an FAA administrator is troubling. The American people deserve a confirmed leader who has a deep knowledge in, and a passion for that matter, for aviation. And because of that, I'm honored and pleased to introduce Michael Whitaker. He's a very qualified nominee that has been put forward for your consideration. Mr. Whitaker is currently the Chief Operating Officer for an advanced air mobility company, which is an aviation sector that is propelling American aviation to new heights and demands both regulatory stability and innovation. Having previously served as the FAA Deputy Administrator, Mr. Whitaker understands what it takes to helm the agencies that he has been nominated to lead. And he has also served many years, obviously, in the travel and airline industries. And as a professional pilot myself, I appreciate the fact that he too is a GA pilot. I've spoken to him on many occasions and visited with him about the need to pass on that passion to the next generation of young Americans and to be an advocate for aviation overall. The bottom line is that having Mr. Whitaker confirmed as the FAA administrator will help provide much-needed certainty for the FAA and the aviation industry, which is pivotal right now in this moment in history. In addition to confirmation of an FAA nominee, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that enacting a long-term FAA reauthorization bill will bring much-needed certainty to the aviation industry. The bipartisan bill that passed out of the House in July by a vote of 351 to 69 is a 5-year bill. And while your committee works towards passage of companion legislation, our shared commitment to enactment of a long-term FAA bill guarantees that the next administrator will be charged with implementing the final product of our work. This adds enormous consequence to the nomination and responsibility of Mr. Whitaker if he is confirmed. And I want to be clear, I fully expect that if Mr. Whitaker is confirmed as administrator, that we will not agree on everything. However, I do believe that we will have a very strong working relationship, just as I've had with his predecessors. And like his predecessors from both Democrat administrations and Republican administrations, I want to see him be successful in the role because that is what is in the best interest of the American aviation industry and in the best interest of the American people. I fought hard against the previous nominee whose lack of relevant experience was greatly concerning, and that's also why I'm here today supporting Mr. Whitaker, because I believe he is the right person for this job. As the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, my job is to hold the administration and any administrator of the FAA accountable for their actions, to conduct rigorous oversight, and to ensure that they are following the legislative intent of any piece of legislation that Congress passes. And rest assured, I will do just that. But I also want to express my support for this committee's consideration today of a nominee who has extensive qualifications in the aviation field and who's very familiar with the FAA, with its importance, with its intricacies, and with its shortcomings. And I believe Mr. Whitaker has the level of experience that the position of FAA administrator demands and prepared to deliver the strong leadership that is needed at the FAA today more than ever before. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope the committee favorably approves Mr. Whitaker's nomination and acts swiftly on finalizing an FAA reauthorization. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. And again, look forward to working with you in that bipartisan fashion to get this over the goal line legislatively by the end of the year. So thank you for that. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to welcome my good friend Sam Graves. I'm glad to see you slumming it on the other side of the Capitol. Welcome. Hope that we've been hospitable and maybe given you a decent cup of coffee this morning. You don't have to answer that. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Whitaker, welcome. A San Antonio native, something I'm always glad to see. Every day, some 3 million passengers board commercial flights in and out of U.S. airports with the confidence that they will safely arrive at their destinations. The public trust is the result of a nearly 8-decade collaboration between the aviation industry and the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA manages 29 million square miles of airspace. It ensures that aircraft and pilots meet the highest safety standards. And it is the FAA that will ensure the safe integration of drones, air taxis, and one day commercial spaceflight. When it comes to aviation safety, the buck stops with the FAA. We are here today to consider the nomination of Michael Whitaker for the FAA Administrator. This is a crucially important role. The next administrator will face serious challenges in rebuilding the FAA after, unfortunately, 18 months without a Senate-confirmed leader. Among those challenges, staffing critical air traffic control facilities, modernizing antiquated air traffic systems, and bringing FAA employees back in person after 3 years of telework. Mr. Whitaker is President Biden's second nominee to be FAA Administrator. The first was rejected by both Republicans and Democrats on this committee for his lack of relevant experience. I'm glad that the administration has heeded my advice and nominated a person with significant experience in aviation, Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker previously served as the second in command at the FAA and has roughly 3 decades of aviation experience. As I have said since we received Mr. Whitaker's nomination, I'm willing to keep an open mind and give him fair consideration on the merits. I want to hear how he's going to address the challenges facing the FAA and the aviation industry should he be confirmed. I also want to ensure that Mr. Whitaker will focus on the FAA's primary responsibility, ensuring the safety of our national aerospace system, while having the fortitude and the clarity of mind to question assumptions and to push back against special interests. Congress gives the administrator a 5-year term because the FAA is not a political organization, is not intended to be a political organization. And we must keep politics out of the FAA. Today, Mr. Whitaker has the opportunity to explain to members of this committee his vision for a stagnant agency, one that is in desperate need of strong and independent leadership willing to challenge the status quo. Mr. Whitaker, I look forward to hearing why you believe you are that independent leader and how you will meet the serious challenges faced by the FAA and the aviation industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Again, Representative Graves, thank you for being here. Mr. Whitaker, if you'd come up and take an opportunity to introduce anybody you would like to introduce this morning before you give your opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today as President Biden's nominee for Administrator of the FAA. I'm grateful for this bipartisan introduction and support from my fellow Vermonter and neighbor, Senator Welch, and also from House Transportation Chairman Sam Graves, who's been very supportive throughout this process, and I thank you both. I would not be here today if it wasn't for the love and support of my family, especially my wife, Mary, who's here with me today, who's been patient and amazingly supportive throughout this process, who's here with our son, Joe, and our daughter, Jordan, who's watching from Vermont. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge Secretary Buttigieg and Deputy Secretary Trottenberg for the exceptional leadership that they have shown ensuring the FAA remains focused on its critical mission to provide the safest and most efficient aerospace system in the world. Throughout my career, I have believed in this mission, not only during my previous tenure at the FAA, but as an airline executive and now as I focus on emerging technologies in our airspace. If confirmed, I will apply my 32 years of aviation experience to lead the 44,000 dedicated professionals at the FAA who work in every U.S. state and territory and across the globe to meet this mission. I began my aviation career as an attorney for Trans World Airlines, then rose through the ranks of United Airlines from senior counsel in a regulatory group to senior vice president of alliances, international, and regulatory affairs. More recently, I have worked with emerging aviation technologies such as small unmanned systems and electric propulsion. However, the key experience that qualifies me for this position and that will allow me to make an immediate impact at the FAA is my 3-year tenure there as Deputy Administrator. During this time, I gained significant technical knowledge of the complex systems that make up the national airspace. And while at FAA, I also earned my private pilot certificate to better understand the national airspace from the perspective of a user of that system. If confirmed, my priority will be the safety of the flying public. They put their trust in the FAA to keep aviation the safest way to travel, and the world has looked to us for decades as the gold standard. To maintain that trust and that title, I would immediately focus on 3 things as administrator. First, I will work not just to maintain the safety record we have collectively achieved, but to build upon it. The 2 Boeing Max crashes remind us that we must be ever vigilant. The FAA must finish implementing the remaining provisions of the certification reform legislation passed by Congress thanks to the leadership of this committee. These changes, along with other actions the FAA has taken, will ensure that the gaps in certification process are fully closed and that we are able to catch risks even when they are not disclosed by a manufacturer. We simply cannot become complacent, and we must continuously improve as an organization. In March, the FAA announced a new goal to end serious close calls. It's critical that we achieve this. It will not be accomplished overnight, but it is urgent work that must continue. Second, we need to build the aviation system of the future. This requires the FAA to be agile and creative, and for all of us to make ongoing investments. When I was at the FAA just a few years ago, drones were new, commercial space launches were rare, and flying taxis were still only in cartoons. All of this has changed, and it requires that the agency look forward, adapt quickly, and execute a plan for the future. Third, none of this can be achieved without making the FAA an employer of choice where aviators want to build their careers. We must have a pipeline of dedicated public servants to achieve our mission. Nowhere is this clearer than the ongoing work to catch up on air traffic controller hiring. The shortage has been years in the making, but you have my commitment to reduce this backlog. The FAA faces big challenges, and it will take innovators and dreamers who bring ideas from every part of our country to solve them. Aviation has opened doors of opportunity for so many, including me. We must make sure it continues to do so for citizens in every corner of the country, no matter their background. I'm honored by the trust the President has placed in me with this nomination. If confirmed, I will remain committed to the FAA's mission and pledge to work with you and the committee to get things done. Thank you for considering my nomination, and I'm pleased to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. So appreciate you and your willingness to serve and your many years of experience. You mentioned your commitment to implementing the safety certification program, which some of it has been implemented, but there's more to do. And I guess I would just say as a summation that the world of aviation since you left the FAA has changed significantly. You mentioned the 737 Max crashes, the COVID pandemic, how we kept airlines moving during that time period. Recently, the NOTAM system outages, near misses, things of that nature. What the FAA needs to do, I think, are even greater challenges since when you were there before. So I appreciate you saying you wanted to fully implement the law, so thank you. Thank you for that. What are your strategies for building a resilient safety culture at the FAA? And what do you think it takes at this point in time to have that safety culture? I just want to mention we were able to implement the Samiastumo Air Grant Program, and I see it already paying dividends on Capitol Hill and at agencies because we have the smartest technology people here helping on the very technical details of aviation. The underlying AXA bill has the integrated project team. Sometimes around here we call them the graybeards. While I'm anxious to see how the graybeards assess technology, as you mentioned in your statement, that may not be disclosed by a manufacturer, and yet you have to understand the huge technology change that is happening. I mean, I wonder at sometime if we shouldn't be looking at a CTO. In some ways, NASA is our CTO, but maybe on the implementation of things as we look at the NOTAM outage and other things, I mean, maybe in addition to the forward thinking that NASA does for the agency, maybe a CTO or these integrated project team leaders are a key to our future. But if you could talk about what it is that you think we need to build in that intersection of changes of technology and safety.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. It's a great question. I think there are a number of aspects to this. We need to build a strong leadership team, make sure we have the right people in the right positions and make sure they're permanent. And we need a strong bench. So I think focusing on making sure we have the expertise in the organization is going to be key. Safety culture doesn't create itself, and I think you have to constantly emphasize that it is our first mission above all else, and everything has to be focused on that. We have to hold the line on pressure to reduce standards and make sure we're keeping this system as safe as possible. The technology issue is a very interesting one. There are a lot of new technologies coming into the agency that you can't prove out through flight testing necessarily. Software is a good example of that. New technologies that interact with each other in ways that maybe we haven't experienced in the past. So I think it is good to look at having somebody with the appropriate technology experience who can see the big picture when a new aircraft with new technology comes in, how the pieces fit together, and where we can look for risks that may not be apparent otherwise.
So you're fully committed to the integrated project team and getting them on board and their oversight in the certification process?
I think further integration in the certification process between groups, including technology, is a key reform from AXA, and we will certainly implement that and look for ways to even go beyond that.
What else do we need to do here on Capitol Hill? You mentioned a bench. I would just call it a resilient workforce. How do we communicate to people what the workforce needs of the FAA are so that we can build this? I think it's one of your key priorities. You mentioned it in your statement, but we're like every other workforce in the nation. We need the right people and we need them now. So what can we do to better enable this FAA workforce?
I think assessing the workforce will be one of the first goals that I have within the agency, and I would look forward to finding ways that we can increase ways to bring people into the agency. I think it's a tight workforce right now in aerospace, and we recruit in the same places that private industry does, and we've got to figure out a way to be competitive to bring the right talent into the agency.
Will you work with us on the ability of the FAA to communicate these outcomes? I think we get in this role between the legislative branch and the agency, and we've had to push for a lot of discussions so that people understand impacts. And so I hope you will commit to being a frequent communicator. I think my former colleague, Senator Whitaker, had his levels of frustration many times before the committee in cooperation with the FAA on information. And what we need is we're the authorizers, but we're not the appropriators. And what needs to be clear to the appropriators is what a shortfall in impact at the FAA will mean for us to do any aspect of the job at the FAA. So if you'll commit to that.
I will. I think communicating better with stakeholders all around will be an important priority as well.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Whitaker, you and Chair Cantwell, just a moment ago, were talking about the need to recruit excellent talent at the FAA, which is certainly a pressing need. I agree. The number of air traffic controllers was a significant concern during your tenure as Deputy Administrator at FAA. You repeatedly touted the FAA's plans to hire 6,000 controllers over 5 years. Years later, unfortunately, the shortage has only grown worse, leading to congestion and frequent delays, especially in the New York airspace. As you know, all newly hired air traffic controllers must complete a training program at the current FAA Academy. But that academy is limited to only about 1,800 individuals per year, and it takes several years to fully train an air traffic controller. Realistically, considering that the attrition rate at the academy and the field training process, we need to hire significantly more than 1,800 each year for several years. If you are confirmed as FAA Administrator, and you look at the issue of controller training and you find what has been consistently said to be the case, that a major choke point in the controller pipeline is the physical limits of the ATC Academy, would you support a second ATC Academy to increase throughput?
Yes, Senator Cruz, I certainly would. And as we discussed, looking at those choke points and understanding where the problems lie will be an early priority, and we just simply need to solve this problem and figure out how to get it done.
I appreciate that commitment. Given that our system is facing a critical air traffic controller shortage, I would hope that one of the first things you would do would be to address this issue. And if you're confirmed quickly by the Senate, can you commit to addressing it and trying to turn it around by the end of the year?
I will, assuming I have enough time to do that, I will, sir.
Thank you. Let me turn to a different question. When you were Deputy Administrator of the FAA, how many days a week did you go into the office?
Every day, sir.
Every day. In late July, the FAA said that employees had to be in the office at least 3 days a week by October 9th. But 2 weeks later, after the FAA hired a senior labor policy advisor for the first time, the agency put that in-person expectation on hold because of union pushback. Do you believe it is important that the FAA return to in-person work?
I do believe it's important to be in person for collaboration and working together. And when I get into the agency, this has been a challenging issue for all organizations, private or public. And I think what needs to happen is, after understanding the situation that we're in and the limitations that might be there, issuing very clear guidance on what the expectations are to get people in the office.
Well, and I will say there's a sharp differential, I think, between private and public. When I talk to businesses in the private sector, virtually all of them, the employees are going back to work, and they're physically present. And yet, throughout the Biden administration, we have a pattern at just about every agency where large portions of the workforce have apparently decided going to the office is optional. And I think that seriously limits the effectiveness of an agency, and particularly an agency whose mission is protecting people's lives in the airspace. If confirmed, will you commit to working diligently to bring FAA employees back to the office?
I will, sir.
When you were deputy administrator of FAA, the certification of the Boeing 737 Max was underway. What was your involvement in the certification of the 737 Max?
I didn't have any involvement in the certification of the Max. I wish I had in retrospect, but the issues around the safety of the MCAS were unknown at that time, at least at the executive level, so they were not raised.
So what went wrong with the certification of the Max?
Well, I think, of course, this has been well studied by this committee and others, but I think I have to say it was a failure all around. It was a failure at Boeing. It was a failure at the system to catch information that was not disclosed by Boeing. And I think the AXA has done a commendable job of plugging a lot of those holes, but I think there's more work to do, and we need to make sure that never happens again.
As a technical matter, what caused the two air crashes with the 737 Max?
Well, I think there are a number of issues. I think the functioning of the MCAS, some of the characteristics of the MCAS, pilot training, or I should say lack of pilot training, lack of awareness of the system was a major contributor. So there were a number of causes.
And let me ask you, what is your level of confidence that the FAA has changed how it approaches those issues so that prospectively there will not be another disaster like we had with the 737 Max?
I won't fully know the answer to that question until I'm there. I understand about 2/3 of the reforms in AXA have been implemented, but it will be a top priority to make sure that's done, and we go beyond that and bring extra vigilance to the situation.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Whitaker, I enjoyed our discussion earlier, and I also am excited about the experience you will bring to this job, and hopefully you will get confirmed swiftly, like everyone gets confirmed in the Senate. Okay, that was a sarcastic joke. But I think we all know that this couldn't be more important. I appreciated Senator Cruz's remarks about the need for the air traffic controllers. Senator Braun and I just introduced something on this, and I understand you want to see a bigger aviation workforce. A bunch of us are working on this with grants and things like that. Tell us what would be most helpful to get the aviation workforce we need.
Well, I think the grants are very helpful. I would view my role as administrator as chief recruitment officer, certainly for FAA, but also for the industry. And I think we need to really build interest in people becoming pilots or controllers or mechanics or flight attendants. It's a great industry, and we need to push the word out a little bit and really cast a broad net to build as broad a pipeline as we can to bring people into aviation.
Right, and Senator Cantwell had mentioned the need to focus on what we saw out of with the system-wide failure that morning that we'll never forget. Senator Moran and I were on the phone with the acting director that day. Could you talk about your commitment to carry out some upgrades to our air mission system? Senator Moran and I and Capito passed a bill on this, actually, to include all the stakeholders that Representative Stauber was carrying. Could you quickly answer that? Then I have a real fun, gong show of questions.
Sure. No, I am committed, and I've been briefed on the matter from FAA, and I understand that work is underway.
Okay, very good. When it comes to the essential air service, we talked about that. Do you agree that we need to ensure that air service reaches travelers outside of urban areas and continue that program?
I do. I think our network of airports in the U.S. is a treasure, and it needs to be. We need to invest in it and keep them viable.
right? Contract Tower program provides critical air traffic control safety benefits to 256 smaller airports across the country, including in St. Cloud, Minnesota, Anoka County Airport. Do you support this program?
I do.
Okay, very good. Here's one that really interests me, sustainable aviation fuels. A lot of our airlines and certainly farmers in Minnesota and many are interested in this, and decarbonizing commercial flight is one of the greatest challenges facing modern aviation. You can't use a plug-in plane. Could you talk about how renewable fuels are a key pathway? Renewable fuels offer an opportunity to reduce emissions and also use homegrown fuel.
I think it's part of the number of initiatives underway to decarbonize, and I know the airline industry is very supportive of that transition. There are other technologies out there, including electric aircraft, that help in that mission as well.
Secretary Vilsack actually would be a good one to talk to about this because it's been one of our big priorities when it comes to renewable fuels. And finally, the Safe Skies Act, and Senator Cantwell, with her great leadership in aviation, has been supportive of this, to take the rest requirements that are put in place for passenger pilots, apply them to cargo pilots that currently have looser rest requirements, but they're all still flying planes in the same airspace. Could you talk about cargo pilots and the work that I think needs to be done from the safety standpoint?
I'm happy to look into that issue. It's not something I'm currently familiar with, but I will look into that.
Okay, very good. You can talk to Sully Sullenberg about that, but anyway.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you get confirmed swiftly. I think it would be a tribute to this committee and our leadership if we are able to get this done strongly on a bipartisan basis. And so I toss it back to the chairwoman here.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing. And I would just say, to put it simply, the FAA has its work cut out for it. On top of implementing the last FAA reauthorization and the certification reform bill, the agency is contending with an increasingly complex national airspace system, which must accommodate the growth in commercial space activity and the integration of drones and advanced air mobility aircraft. And managing all of those challenges while maintaining the highest level of safety in the world's busiest aviation system requires a skilled leader with extensive aviation experience. So I look forward to today's discussion. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being here today and for being willing to take on this role. I have a whole bunch of questions on contract towers, airspace, UAS integration, and some other subjects that I would probably submit for the record. But I want to talk about the current training for transport pilots. Airline transport pilots requires the vast majority of their flight hours to be accumulated in the cockpit. Now, I fully recognize the value of cockpit experience and see time in real aircraft as an essential part of training airline pilots. However, I am concerned that little to none of the currently required flight hours are accumulated in the type of aircraft that these pilots will be flying should they get a job with an airline. Instead, they're typically accumulated in small single-engine aircraft. To address this issue, Senator Sinema and I have offered an amendment to the Senate FAA reauthorization codifying the recommendations of the Air Carrier Training, or ARC, to create a 2-month enhanced qualification program completed in exchange for a 250-hour credit toward the requisite aeronautical experience. The EQP's use of simulator training, whose proven value has resulted in extensive use by the military and instruction, I would add, from seasoned airline pilots, would give trainee exposure to the cockpits and the jets that they would actually be flying, and crucially allow them to experience what it's like to handle challenging and dangerous situations in these cockpits. So there's a bipartisan group of former FAA administrators and ALPA presidents who recently called on Congress to expand the use of simulator training, stating that, and I quote, "requiring the repeated practice of the prevention of and recovery from myriad real-world accident scenarios in full motion flight simulators will make better pilots," end quote. So, Mr. Whitaker, I frankly find it hard to believe that anyone would disagree with the statement from a respected group of aviation safety officials. Just like the adoption of ADS-B, which you championed when you were last at FAA, the agency's leadership in adopting new technologies has significantly benefited aviation safety time and time again, making the U.S. aviation system the safest in the world. So having said all that, my question is, can you describe how, if confirmed, you would work to ensure the FAA takes the same leadership role in expanding the use of flight simulators to ensure that new pilots are well-rounded and best prepared to fly safely in airline operations?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I guess there are a couple of pieces to this. I think the 1,500-hour rule has been, of course, it's legislated, so we follow the law and implement that rule. But I think since it's been passed, it is an important fabric of our safety network, if you will, and it has yielded good results in our operating system. The simulator issue is an interesting one. It involves a lot of different technologies and a lot of open questions, and there's an ARC that's been formed at FAA to look at how that might be used and how we might look at pathways for reaching that 1,500 hours. I know from my time at United Airlines, there are simulators and there are simulators. Some of the ones you mentioned, the full motion 777 simulator that United Airlines would operate is an incredibly valuable tool for training airline pilots and running through scenarios and accidents and the like. But there are also multi-million-dollar machines that wouldn't normally be available for a pilot trying to get 1,500 hours. I know that the technology has developed in simulators. We know that a desktop computer is not an adequate simulator for flight training, but understanding what the possible uses are, I think, is something that we should leave to the experts in the ARC, take their recommendations and consider those.
Okay. Well, and I hope you will. I mean, that's essentially what we're operating off of here.
Yep.
All right, very quickly, talking a little bit about UASs, if confirmed, can you describe how you will work to create a beyond visual line of sight regulatory framework and otherwise streamline the airworthiness approval process for UAS?
I think the next step with BVLOS is getting a rule out. I don't have access to where that process stands right now, but it seems to me that the time is come to do that and move as quickly as we can.
We've got a bill, Senator Warner and I, that addresses this issue, which I hope you all will take a look at, but I just think this is something that stakeholders, everybody's been waiting for us to address, and I hope that as you undertake this new responsibility, that you will work to implement a system that's not only safe, but is something that can accommodate what we're going to see is in terms of increased use, I think, of those types of aircraft for lots of different applications.
I agree, sir, and I will.
Thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being here today and for your willingness and your family's willingness to serve to ensure our nation's aviation system is safer, especially at a time when we are experiencing alarming safety crises. The FAA needs a leader who will be proactively strengthening the post-Hogan era safety system and work with Congress to secure transformational investments that will enable America to recruit and train the next generation of air traffic controllers and pilots and mechanics. Airlines broke the pilot pipeline when they decided that the best strategy to deal with the 1,500-hour rule that they claim is causing the pilot shortage was to spend their hard-earned cash on mass buyouts that resulted in tens of thousands of their most experienced pilots exiting the system, the workforce. The mass exodus of pilot experience was compounded by a wave of retirement of air traffic controllers, many possessing decades' worth of experience. And being from Illinois, we're very familiar with tornadoes. And just like warm air and cold air colliding together to create a tornado, plummeting aviation experience levels combined with a post-pandemic surge in travel that created a perfect storm we're witnessing now in all these near misses and safety incidents. The aviation system's margin of safety has been reduced, and the results are downright terrifying. According to the New York Times, in a 12-month period, there were 300 accounts of near collisions involving Part 121 carriers. That's almost one near miss per day so far this year. Yet, despite the alarming evidence that we must raise experience levels and bolster training across the aviation workforce, some airlines are continuing their years-long campaign to weaken or water down the post-Hogan era reforms. Mr. Whitaker, if confirmed, you will face heavy pressure from cost-cutting carriers looking to water down experience requirements. You will hear arguments that the 1,500-hour rule is too rigorous because foreign countries require much less time. But I don't want our nation's aviation system to mimic foreign regulations. I want the United States to operate the safest airspace in the world, and I'm sure you do as well. I want the FAA to commit to doing everything in its power to ensure that the next set of safety reforms are not written in the blood of passengers killed in an aviation incident. Complacency kills. That is why the next FAA administrator must proactively work to increase experience and training requirements before our luck runs out and this year's near misses turn into next year's deadly collisions. Mr. Whitaker, if confirmed, will you protect the post-Kogan era safety system by rejecting efforts to water down the 1,500-hour rule that requires a pilot build at least 1,500 flight hours to earn an ATP certificate?
Yes, Senator. Of course, the 1,500-hour rule is legislative, and we will certainly work to maintain its integrity. It's been an important part of the safety system, and any changes I would recommend would go through an ARC process to make sure we're not lowering the bar in any way.
Thank you. Debates over the 1,500-hour rule often provoke intense disagreement. Yet, carriers and safety advocates alike appear skeptical of the value of so-called diploma mill institutions, which enable pilots to efficiently earn the 1,500 hours of flying, as I've been told, circles in cloudless blue skies without a gust of wind. But you can do the same thing in a simulator where you are not practicing the exact maneuvers needed, and you can be also flying 15 hours, endless hours in blue skies, and God knows what type of simulator. So we would need to specify exactly what type of simulator usage, what type of procedures are being practiced. Mr. Whitaker, if confirmed, will you work to enhance safety by strengthening the 1,500-hour rule, specifically by refining what type of flight hours count towards meeting the rule, such as, for example, requiring more than 50 hours be spent flying in the class of airplane for the rating that will be sought, something that the airlines have talked to me about, which I agree with, which is precisely the type of experience that these regional carriers are asking for.
I think those are excellent points, and I think they specifically apply to any use of simulators so that we're very clear on what constitutes a simulator, what's acceptable, how do you log the time, and what sort of maneuvers. You can't just go for a pleasure flight on your simulator. It doesn't really add much to the equation. So I think those are excellent points.
I think this is why a very vague proposed language such as structured training in a simulator is causes me to be very skeptical. If you don't specifically say you need, exact hours flying an actual IMC, if you don't have actual requirement to fly in the exact type of aircraft, all of these lead to lack of pilot experience. And I have to say, in all the years that I flew, the top types of simulators that the Army had, full motion, everything, not once did we ever practice the procedure that resulted in my surviving the RPG that hit my aircraft. And in fact, when I was told that had I experienced that every time we were in the aircraft and we simulated experiencing what we experienced, a total loss of all avionics, we were told, you're just gonna die. And then you pause the simulator. But it was the years of experience that caused us to be able to land that aircraft. And that's what I want for our air traffic control system. I hope it is the same for you.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And I have one more question for the record on the 737 MAX.
Thank you.
But I'll submit that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Moran.
Senator Cantwell, thank you. Thank you to you and Senator Cruz for rescheduling today's hearing from tomorrow to today. It would be a terrible mistake if we lost another couple of weeks in our efforts to get a confirmed and capable director, administrator of the FAA. And I'm glad to see that you share that priority. I also want to associate myself with the remarks of Senator Cruz in a couple of, particularly in a couple of instances in which he spoke about the importance of workforce and returning to the office. That needs to be a federal-wide circumstance, but I hope you will fully take the lead that you described to Senator Cruz to see that that happens at the Federal Aviation Administration. And also, it baffles my mind that we desperately need air traffic controllers so critically, and yet the gap that is created by lack of educational facilities and training remains. And so I appreciated your answer to both of Senator Cruz's questions. Let me ask a couple of questions. You're nominated at a unique time in the history of the FAA. Airspace is congested and new entrants are arriving daily. As the demand for aviation continues to grow, coupled with unprecedented challenges the industry's faced over the past few years, what lessons did you learn? What lessons did you learn as the deputy administrator that prepare you to be the administrator in these days?
Thank you, Senator Moran. I learned an infinite amount during those 3 years. It was really quite instructive, both on a technical side. I learned particularly to appreciate the 5,000 airports that we have in this country, some of them dating back to World War II and military uses. And I know from my experience with some startups that are looking at new technologies, these airports present a structure of infrastructure that is an opportunity, a business opportunity. I know Beta from Vermont is already building charging stations and the like at small airports to create their own network of connectivity. So I think my experience, particularly in the airspace, will help me chart a path forward for integrating a lot of these new technologies going forward.
Your experience as a Chief Operating Officer at Supernal, can you identify ways you will shepherd exciting technologies, AAM in particular, safely and efficiently into our national airspace?
So safety will always be the #1 priority, but we can't use that as an excuse not to move more quickly. I think the key is to have an integrated vision for how these various new entrants, whether it's commercial space launch, supersonic travel, small drones, or vertical takeoffs that turn into horizontal flight, can fit into our existing system. I think that's going to involve some technologies in the system that we haven't had before, and it's going to involve a roadmap on how to implement those technologies.
Senator Duckworth and I and others have been fully engaged in air mobility issues, and it seems things move at a glacially slow pace. And the difficulty we face, certainly no one could disagree with your comments about safety. It is the priority. But we operate in a world in which competitors cannot have the advantage of a regulatory system that moves much more rapidly than what I've seen in our circumstance. And it's true beyond just these new advanced technologies. We need to be competitive in this world as we manufacture, develop, research, and engineer new entrants into the realm. I would ask you a final question. Assure me that you will take charge and be a strong and determined leader in a circumstance in which there's lots of bureaucracy and backlog that makes that a challenge.
Senator, I can give you that assurance, and I feel like my time at FAA gives me some real advantage. I'm known in the agency, and I know a lot of people there, and I have a pretty clear vision for the mission, and I know it's a hard job, and I know it's an important job, and I embrace that.
Well, Mr. Whitaker, you will have a tough job if confirmed ahead of you. I've not said this publicly. You and I have met. You and I have had a telephone conversation, and today's hearing. Everything I know about you suggests that you should be confirmed, and my intention is to vote for your confirmation and encourage my colleagues to do so as well.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Whitaker, congratulations on your nomination and your willingness to take what is truly a challenging job. So we appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Whitaker, as Michigan Senator, I have the privilege of representing 9 rural airports that are served by Essential Air Service program. That is the most of any state in the lower 48. And many of those airports are in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula and host only a couple of round trips per day. In fact, I'm going to take one of those aircraft on Friday up to one of those northern Michigan cities that is serviced through EAS. The proposed Senate FAA reauthorization bill this year includes a provision that I championed that would hold airlines accountable when they break their contracts with these small communities who rely on them for service. It's absolutely essential that they continue to get this service. And under the proposed new EAS rules, it would be harder for airlines to terminate contracts early, and the Department of Transportation would be empowered to penalize airlines that abandon these EAS communities. I believe this is essential to preventing uncertainty and lapses in services in communities like Houghton, Michigan, which experienced this very issue last year. So my question for you, sir, is if confirmed, will you work with Congress to protect the Essential Air Service Program and hold airlines accountable to the communities that they serve in rural areas, not just in my state, but all across the country?
Yes, sir. I believe that the EAS program and our network of smaller airports is really key to our system, and I will work with you to support the appropriate safety mechanisms and infrastructure in those airports, and then work with DOT on administrating the EAS program.
Good, thank you. Mr. Whitaker, Gerald R. Ford International Airport in Grand Rapids, Michigan is Michigan's second largest airport. It sees well over 200 aircraft operations each and every day, and it serves a very rapidly growing part of our state as well. However, even as Grand Rapids serves record numbers of passengers, it's been stymied in its efforts to expand and modernize because of a 60-year-old FAA air traffic control tower that the agency has not acted to replace. And that's why last year I secured $5 million in congressionally directed spending for the airport to begin the design process to replace the tower, but clearly the job's not done yet. My question for you is, will you commit to working with me and the Grand Rapids Airport to ensure that there's a plan to replace their tower in a timely fashion, if confirmed?
Yes, sir, I will.
Well, thank you. I have also long advocated for the FAA to transition away from the use of toxic PFAS containing firefighting foams. Last year, President Biden signed into law my Preventing PFAS Runoff at Airports Act, which will allow airports to purchase the equipment they need to test their firefighting response without discharging toxic PFAS chemicals. This year, the proposed FAA reauthorization bill includes provisions that I champion to ensure a quick transition to these new non-PFAS firefighting foam alongside financial resources for airports to make that transition. Michigan airports continue to lead the way on this issue, but they need a strong partner in the FAA to fully transition away from the use of these chemicals to protect our communities, to protect their firefighters from contamination. So if confirmed, I'd like to certainly get your commitment to work with airports to end the use of PFAS in aviation and your thoughts generally on this challenge.
Thank you, Senator. I'm new to the issue, but I understand the FAA has been doing work following the DoD guidance on transitioning from the fluorine-free foams and also looking for new forms of product to fight fires effectively. So we will continue to have that engagement with you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Whitaker, in your questionnaire, you said one of your top 3 priorities is rebuilding the FAA workforce for the future. And I certainly agree that our focus must be on building a robust workforce of air traffic controllers, pilots, maintenance technicians, aviation engineers, and other workers. I also believe we can't meet this goal without doing more to recruit and retain women in these fields. Currently, 5% of airline pilots are women, and even fewer serve in the other aviation fields. I've heard directly from a Michigander who served on the FAA's Women in Aviation Advisory Board, Callie Yost, about the work the board did to direct FAA industry and congressional action to support women in industry. And that's why I introduced the Promoting Women in Aviation Act, and I'm fighting to have it included in the FAA reauthorization package. Can you speak to the importance of building a strong aviation workforce pipeline and finding ways to recruit and retain women in these critical positions?
I think casting as broad a net as we can and making it as inclusive as possible is necessary. We need a lot of folks to have interest in aviation and all those jobs you've mentioned. So I do support that.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the hearing today. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being with us, and thank you for the time to visit by phone. And Madam Chairman, I hope we can move soon to the FAA Reauthorization Act and get that finished. The House passed their mark on that bill back in July, and we need to take that up so we can all move forward. Mr. Whitaker, let's talk a little bit about drones, which we did as we visited last week. As we noted, DOD, CISA, let's see, Interior, Commerce, and Treasury have all warned about the threats that are there as we look at Chinese drones. And because of that, I introduced the Stop Illicit Drones Act, and it would prohibit the FAA from operating or providing federal funds to certain foreign drone companies. And this is all to protect us and our country. And I'd like to hear from you, if you're confirmed, what will you do to guard against this threat that we have from Chinese drones, and how are you going to raise awareness on this issue?
Thank you, Senator Blackburn, and thanks for taking the time last week for us to meet. This is a very serious issue, and I think national security, protecting our airspace, protecting our intellectual property as an economy are all very important issues. The FAA's role here is to really work with various other agencies, law enforcement agencies, to make sure we have the adequate protections in place, regardless of where the drone is manufactured, to protect, particularly from my perspective, the airspace.
Okay, and Chinese drones specifically, would you agree with prohibiting federal funds for the purchase of these drones?
I'll certainly defer to this body on the legislation that they put forward, and I'll defer to the law enforcement agencies on how to best approach it. But clearly, there are risks associated with drones in that category, yes.
Okay, I want to talk with you about 5G because I have an amendment that I filed to the Reauthorization Act to create an R&D grant program to develop, test, and certify standards for ensuring the telecom industry and the FAA can meet installation requirements for next-gen radio by 2024. So do you believe that this would help mitigate the FAA broadband carrier dispute over 5G in planes?
I think there's been tremendous progress in resolving this issue, and I know that the industry is equipped. I think the level is over 90% now of equipage to include mitigations for any interference from the 5G. So I think I'll continue to work with you on making sure that is completed.
Okay, that is great because that is something we need to see completed. The New York Post earlier this year had an article on the epidemic surrounding aviation employees using their credentials and privileges to smuggle drugs through airports and on to airplanes. And I, like many of my colleagues, have worked visiting different airports and looking at some of these issues. And so how do you plan to work with TSA to counter these illegal operations that are being carried out on the tarmac at some of our nation's airports?
We would certainly follow the lead of TSA and any other law enforcement agencies involved in stopping those activities and contribute to that, stopping them as much as we could.
Well, build on that a little bit. How would you work with other entities that are there in the aviation ecosystem to ensure that these guys are not going to be on the tarmac and are not going to be able to carry this out?
So our security folks at FAA have well-established networks of cooperation with the various agencies, so we can track that down through that network and find out how we can contribute to fighting this.
I've got one other question I'll submit to you, but it has to do with some of the bilateral aviation safety agreements that we have in place. And we've had some issues with the lack of leadership within the FAA as we look at these, not honoring either the letter or the spirit of the law. I'll send that to you for a written response. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. I want to just say, we really do believe that fentanyl transported at airports is an issue, so we will work with Senator Blackburn and you on that. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for being here today, Mr. Whitaker, and your willingness to serve the country.
Thank you.
The FAA Administrator is a very, very important position, particularly if you're sitting on this side of the rostrum, because we fly a lot, okay? So the job you do impacts us daily, and impacts the American people daily, so it's important. Workforce is a major problem throughout this country. I don't care what industry, and finding workers is tough duty. The same is true with the folks who run our towers, who do a marvelous job, but we're seeing shortages there too. And my question to you is do you have any plans on how we can address that workforce shortage? Because quite frankly, truly is a life and death situation if you've got folks that are working too many hours and they're in a difficult situation. They do a great job, they work hard, there just ain't enough of them. How can we fix it?
So, Senator, I'm sorry, there was some noise behind me. Are you referring to the towers?
Yes.
Yes. It is definitely an area that we need to focus on and we need to fix. It's been going on for too long, and I think it was exacerbated by COVID and not necessarily understanding the direction that air traffic was going to go during that time period. We have to have as wide a pipeline as we can to bring controllers into this space. An air traffic controller is a very good job. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would like to do it. Same with a lot of aviation jobs. So it's time that we aggressively go after that. And I think part of my role will be chief recruiting officer for the agency and making the agency an employer of choice for people who are having an aviation career and are looking for an opportunity to enter.
Well, I think it's going to take some creative thinking because you're right. I think there's a lot of people that want to be in the business, but we don't have enough people. And so whatever you can do in that vein to get more folks available, I think makes the skies a safer place. So thank you. Now I want to talk about pilots.
Yep.
I come from a state where these are destinations, they're not hubs. All the airports there. We've got fewer flight options. In fact, it's fair to say, at least in my case, that this is a different world. This flying world is a different world post-pandemic than it was pre-pandemic. And it's not better, it's worse. And part of it is we don't have enough pilots. And I thought I had a beautiful solution after being in an American Airlines simulator. I thought we can do this with simulators for a portion of it until the lady to my right pointed out to me that all simulators aren't alike. Being a pilot, she knew that. And I went, oh man, there goes that brilliant idea I had. So how can we fix this? How can we utilize ways to get more pilots into the pipe, and we're paying them a decent amount of money, but more pilots into the pipeline and still keep our airplanes safe, still have pilots behind the stick that know what they're doing, and move forward so that I can get more flights into a place like Great Falls, Montana, that, by the way, oftentimes if I miss a night flight, the next flight in is the next night, okay? So give me some hope.
So I think, thank you for the question. I think the pilot situation, it was long in the making. It, for many years, was a pretty rocky profession. It's very expensive to become a pilot, just like it is to become a doctor or lawyer. It assumes a lot of debt often. And then the starting salaries were very, very low. So a regional pilot 15 years ago might have made $20,000 a year, while a lawyer in a law firm might have made $100,000. So there was a pretty big disparity. Those salaries have gone up quite a bit, both at the entry level and at the airline level. So I think the market's working and is going to work and help correct that. I think what we can do is look at other ways to facilitate people coming into the industry. And I think your point on simulators is a good one. It's a complicated issue. There are simulators and there are simulators, and then how you spend your time is important, which is why we've got an ARC at FAA that's looking at this, safety professionals looing at it to see, are there consensus avenues that we can create to 1,500 hours?
Okay, you've got, do I have 55 seconds? You've got a rulemaking committee that's going to make some recommendations to you and potentially even Congress, is that correct?
They make the recommendations to the FAA, but we'll certainly work with Congress on those.
Okay, that's good. But can you push that committee to do their due diligence but get a rule out sooner rather than later?
I will do all I can to do that, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Whitaker.
Thank you.
I've heard from stakeholders that they're facing substantial delays in the certification and operational approval that could improve aviation safety. To address this, I worked on bipartisan language in the Senate FAA reauthorization bill, creating a new Associate Administrator for Advanced Aviation Technology and Innovation. This FAA leadership level position would be charged with improving how the agency works across lines of business to certify advanced technologies more rapidly and break down barriers delaying the adoption of aviation technologies. Drawing from your prior industry experience, do you believe that the FAA places enough emphasis on the certification of advanced technologies? And would this new position improve how the agency responds to the pace of innovation?
Thank you, Senator. I think that's a very astute question and certainly to the point. I think these new technologies coming into the agency are one of the biggest challenges we're facing. We don't necessarily understand everything about them, especially when there's extensive software involved in interactions between new technologies. So we need to have resources put in making sure there's a holistic understanding of how these systems interact and where the risks are and where the faults are. So I think that's a step in the right direction, certainly.
Good. Also, the Nebraska Division of Aeronautics serves as the agent for airport sponsors seeking federal grants. It's been noted that the interpretation of eligibility and requirements for projects are not uniformly enforced from region to region, state to state, and even between different FAA planners and engineers within a state. So what can be done to straighten this out? How can you as FAA administrator at that level ensure that requirements are interpreted and administered uniformly across this country?
I think it's important that we have a very transparent and uniform system to allocate funding across the system so that it is applied fairly, and I would certainly provide direction to make sure that happens. And then from that baseline, there are always exceptions for unique circumstances, and we have to have the flexibility to adapt to that as well, but it needs to be a completely fair and transparent system.
You know, when we have some of these cases brought to our attention, though, if we're able to present that information to you, will you take a personal interest in trying to figure out just why maybe some of these discrepancies are happening?
I'd be happy to work with you on that, yes.
Thank you. One of FAA's most successful government industry partnerships is the FAA Contract Tower program, and that includes one we have in Grand Island, Nebraska. This critical air traffic safety program is important to maintain and develop air service in rural states like mine. There have been attempts in the past to shut down the Contract Tower program over budget concerns. Can you give me assurances that you will support the Contract Tower program given its really vital importance to the national airspace system, and that contract towers will remain a high priority for the FAA if you're confirmed as administrator?
Yes, Senator, I can give you that assurance. I think contract towers are an important part of our network of smaller airports, and we need to maintain those and make sure they're viable.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for joining us today. As you know, the FAA has lacked Senate-confirmed leadership for over a year and a half. It's essential that the leader has the right experience at this particularly tough time. The next administrator will need to effectively evaluate arguments over aviation safety and near misses, air traffic controller staffing, short and long-term workforce development concerns, new technologies, novel regulatory questions, and more. So my first question for you, Mr. Whitaker, is I agree with you that safety is the top priority and the preeminent responsibility of the FAA. I appreciate your emphasis on not just maintaining the FAA safety record, but continuing to build upon it. I believe that updating our pilot training rules is a critical part of this, so the U.S. continues to lead the world in aviation safety. Rather than waiting around for a tragedy or deferring to unhelpful rhetoric, It's critical to build on our prior successes in training the world's best pilots. It's not just me who feels this way, but also each of the Senate-confirmed FAA administrators since 1997, including your former boss, Michael Whitaker. I'm sure you saw their letter last month, which also was signed by 2 former presidents of the Airline Pilots Association. These experts make clear that the significant technological advances in flight training in the nearly 15 years since the tragic Colgan Air crash require their use to ensure the best pilot training continues. They argued, quote, incorporating this realistic training and experience in a structured and controlled way will add to the existing margin of safety in commercial operations, end quote. The Air Force also agrees it's more than tripled the amount of simulator training for its new pilots, including at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. Now, current FAA rules appreciate the military pilot training regime so much that pilots leaving the military need only 750 rather than the standard 1,500 hours for their certificate. So credit is provided for what's considered superior military training, which incorporates superior simulator training. So, Mr. Whitaker, do you agree with these experts and former FAA administrators that properly using advanced simulators produces safer pilots without compromise?
Thank you, Senator. I do agree that simulators are a hugely valuable training tool, and we've seen that in large airlines with full motion simulators that allow pilots to go through scenarios that you would not want to do in an actual aircraft. I think the 1,500-hour rule is of course law, and we are open to any way to improve safety from that baseline. I think the challenge is that there are a variety of types of simulators. There are open questions about what kind of training would be involved, how you would log that. And the FAA has an ARC that has been convened to look at those issues. And I look forward to seeing their results from that work, and hope we can continue to work on this issue.
Well, thank you. Do you agree that as pilot training technology evolves, it's the responsibility of the FAA and policymakers to evolve with it by incorporating these simulators and other modern training systems into the existing pilot training regime? And do you believe that advanced simulators have a significant role to play in improving safety outcomes?
I certainly agree that advanced simulators can have a significant role to play in improving safety outcomes. I think the challenge is that the simulators that the airlines are using are much too expensive to be available to most young pilots or new pilots trying to reach 1,500 hours. So I think the challenge is to define when is a simulator appropriate for that kind of training, and that's something that we should be leaving to the ARC. And then, to your point, I think this technology evolves quickly, and we have to figure out a way to keep up with it.
Thank you. FAA leadership will also be tasked with rapid changes in technology and new entrants to the national airspace, including advanced air mobility. Now, I'm a proponent of AAM technology, and I believe it holds incredible promise. Can you speak to how your experience at FAA with the next-gen system, as well as your current work in the nascent AAM industry, prepares you to lead the industry at this critical time? And specifically, what do you believe are the most important things you must do, if confirmed, to foster AAM innovation without sacrificing safety?
I think the next-gen program was a successful and significant upgrade of the air traffic system that took many, many years to pull together. It was designed as a 15-year program, but as we sit here today, traffic is controlled by satellite and communications are being pushed out for flight plans by data rather than voice. So I think it was a successful transition, but I think we're at a point we need to talk about what's next. And what next is new capabilities, new technologies, what that platform looks like, and how we incorporate not only AAM, but small UAS and commercial space and supersonic and other new entrants into the market. So that will be an immediate focus, but it is developing that long-term vision in a collaborative way.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Cantwell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Budd.
Thank the chair. Mr. Whitaker, good to see you. I enjoyed our meeting last week. And from that meeting, I understand that you're a private pilot. So does your experience as a private pilot in general aviation, does that help enhance your experience back from when you served as deputy administrator?
It did, Senator, and thank you for taking the time last week. It was an extremely valuable thing. It helped me really understand the system and appreciate what's at stake when you're up there in that thin tin can.
We spoke about basic med, and back in 2017, pilots of smaller aircraft could use an alternate medical certification program known as basic med. More than 70,000 pilots have used Basic Med to maintain their flying privileges. In March, FAA reported to Congress that pilots flying under Basic Med are just as safe as pilots with a third-class medical. So what are your thoughts on the Basic Med program?
Thank you, Senator. So I completed my Basic Med just a few weeks ago. I had gone through a regular medical examiner previously for the 2-year check. This time I did the Basic Med because I had a physical scheduled and tried it, printed out the form, took it to the doctor, took the online course that you required, which I actually thought was quite useful. So I thought it was a very clever efficiency that actually, in my view, yielded more information and was more useful to the pilot.
Very good. I'm glad to hear your feedback on Basic Med. Now, you may remember this from your previous tenure at FAA, but if it were up to the FAA, Basic Med would have never happened. Despite several requests for third-class medical reform over more than 20 years, 2 decades, the FAA did not act until Congress mandated those reforms. So I bring this example up because many enabling regulations come from Congress in FAA reauthorization bills, and they have a deadline attached to them. Yet FAA routinely misses congressionally mandated deadlines for these new rules. My office analysis found that the FAA missed congressional rulemaking deadlines in the last 3 FAA reauthorization bills by an average of 543 days. Even more concerning, there are still 14 mandatory rulemaking stretching back over a decade to the 2012 reauthorization that FAA has not yet completed to this day. FAA also missed reporting deadlines by an average of 554 days, depriving Congress of crucial information needed to legislate and conduct oversight. Reports during your tenure as Deputy Administrator were 678 days late on average. If confirmed, what will you do to ensure that the FAA is meeting the deadlines that Congress places into law?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I will do everything I can to make sure that we are on schedule. I think rulemaking is a very frustrating thing from every perspective. It's highly regulated under the Administrative Procedures Act. It takes a long time. It's a frustration as we try to bring new entrants into the airspace and have to go through that onerous process. But I will do everything within my power and within the confines of that to move as quickly and communicate with this committee on the status of those.
Thank you. So I share your concern about maintaining FAA's global leadership in aviation safety and regulation. That position greatly benefits our domestic aviation industry and allows companies to pioneer the next generation of aviation technology. I'm proud that North Carolina is home to many of these companies, but in order to innovate, industry needs to know the rules of the road or the rules of the air. That goes back to the speed of new regulations. So what can Congress, so our end, what can we do to help FAA speed up those enabling regulations that are necessary for these new industries to grow?
I wish I had a good answer for that. Most of the review periods and the public comment periods are set by statute. I think we have power within the FAA and DOT and OMB to try to move that as fast as we can, and I would work those levers.
So I hope you hear in the question to you and the question about us as Congress, you hear a desire for us to work together. So if successful, I hope that we can continue to work together. So ever since the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, America has been a world leader in the aviation industry. The FAA sets the gold standard for aircraft certification standards and aviation safety. I'm glad to see the Biden administration finally put forward a qualified nominee to fill a vacancy that has lasted over 550 days. Mr. Whitaker, if you're confirmed, I look forward to working with you to implement the upcoming FAA reauthorization and address the many challenges facing the aviation industry today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Welch.
Thank you. And I've been to hearings that have been a little rougher on the person in your chair than this one. And I think it's a testament to your qualifications, and I'm delighted at the reception you're getting, but I think it reflects your experience. Just a couple things. Senator Budd was asking about your private pilot's license, and that was a concern that the committee had with some of the prior nominees, that they weren't a pilot, and I think you answered that pretty well. But I'm kind of interested in your decision to become a pilot. It was when you were at the FAA. So why did you make that decision? And just quickly, because you've addressed this, How does it inform what you're doing?
Thank you, Senator. It really derived from my role as the Chief Next Gen Officer. All of that technology was around how the controllers interact with the pilot in that situation, and I wanted to understand it from that perspective. And it helps to understand somewhat abstract principles around navigation if you actually go through it. So that was really the driving force.
Okay, second thing, the number of people brought up the delay issue and how long it takes, and I'm with them on that. But it's a dilemma, I imagine, if you're the head of the agency, where you absolutely can't compromise safety. It's what Senator Duckworth has been the leader on this committee and focusing on. But there can be times where that becomes an excuse not to do your job.
I agree.
And act and make a decision. Not cut corners, but try to expedite it. Can you talk about the role you will play in maintaining that standard, but not allowing the agency to hide behind that standard rather than do their job in an efficient and prompt way?
No, I think that's an excellent point, and I agree, and I think we can't allow safety become an excuse for inaction, and I think that does happen. I think decision-making in a large organization is an interesting thing. You need to have accountability. If you don't have clear leadership and visibility into where things are stuck, if you will, then they often don't get made. So,
okay, and just on that point, Senator Cruz is concerned about folks being back in the office, and I know that's an issue that is throughout America, not just public agencies, but private. And can you speak to that? Because I think Senator Cruz got a legitimate point there.
No, I agree. Of course, a lot of our workforce is back, the air traffic controllers and safety inspectors and the like. But to build a cohesive leadership team and move forward, we need to have in-person encounters. So that will be establishing a clear policy and enforcing that will be an early action.
Okay, and then the last area that I want to ask is about the advanced air mobility industry. And as you, I'm sure, know, in Vermont, we have a new, very exciting company, Beta Technologies, that just yesterday opened up its production facility. Will be the largest one east of the Mississippi, and our governor was there, former Senator Leahy was there, the entire congressional delegation. But that goes into that's electric planes, and it's going to require regulations. And can you tell me two things? One, your thoughts about AAM, and number two, the role that the FAA has to play in facilitating that while, of course, maintaining what I'll call the Duckworth standard of safety.
Thank you, Senator. So I think with AAM, there is an opportunity for certification under existing rules, and I believe that Beta is moving under those existing rules. But I think as that technology evolves and matures, we probably need a more aggressive set of rules to allow tighter operations and more application of technology for efficiency in those spaces.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good luck to you.
Thank you, sir.
And welcome.
Thanks.
I yield back.
Senator Capito.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whitaker, for being here, and thank you for visiting my office. I'm going to follow up on what my colleague from Vermont was talking about, because my local airport, Yeager Airport, has just been to Vermont to look at this, and I'm not using the same term that he used. They use the eVTOL, which is an electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. I'm assuming we're talking about the same or similar thing. So this would be next generation technology, but I think it holds a lot of promise really for rural areas to be the centers of excellence, and also the innovators here in terms of where we take this electrification on these types of vehicles. What kind of ideas would you have in terms of where the FAA might be able to be helpful in terms of building out? It's a different infrastructure that would be needed, just like electric cars would be different. How do you envision something like that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. In the case of Beta, it's an interesting case because I think they started as a eVTOL company, and now that's a fixed-wing departure. So they're more of a traditional aircraft design. They are dealing with the infrastructure issue by installing their own infrastructure at airports. But I think for the FAA, we're following the the path that is being set by the companies. So as these companies need infrastructure for electric power and things, we need to be able to respond to that. But I do think it offers tremendous opportunity for smaller communities. The simplicity of operation it means the cost is much lower. The maintenance is much lower on these types of vehicles. So it lowers your unit cost and opens up more markets. So I think it really is a potential opportunity for smaller communities.
I do too, and it's a much less cluttered airspace too, to
Absolutely.
be able to handle the innovation.
Right.
In 2020, and it seems like this is another never-ending story, but the FCC and the FAA and DOD have gotten into a fiasco over the 5G spectrum. This has created significant issues in this committee and elsewhere. I'm wondering, would you commit to being a strong advocate to try to seek to avoid these similar issues, sit down at the table and work these things out so that we don't lay it at the table at the last minute to try to decide what direction to go?
I would commit to that. I think collaboration is a good way to avoid a lot of misunderstanding and to reach alignment up front on difficult issues like that. So yes, I would.
Let me go back to rural, thank you for that, rural air service. I can speak from experience that it's contracting, it's not expanding in terms of availabilities. There have been some different companies that have come into play to sort of do niche kinds of things, which are great. This is great for an area such as mine. Do you see the loss of rural air service as an urgent problem, and how could you work to address that?
I think it is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. I think the pilot demand has been such that it has left smaller communities behind in some case. So I think we want to try to encourage as many people into this profession as we can. I think the rising salaries will help draw people into this profession. But we want to make sure we're supporting that effort as well by keeping the airports up to safety standards and improving them as appropriate so you can attract traffic.
Well, I think too on the pilot shortage issue, we just had a Women in Aviation expo around the state to try to encourage and have a broader reach to recruit more women, but also different types of populations into becoming a pilot. We have several pilot schools that have just kind of grown in the last several years, so I'm very encouraged by that. Let me ask you, in your prior experience at FAA, how many visits to the tower, how important is that for you to have those on-site visits, and how does that kind of inform your work going forward?
I was a frequent visitor to our facilities around the country, including towers, both in large urban areas, but also in remote areas, including contract towers. So I think it's key to hear the voices on the ground. Usually there are opinions about what technology they should have, but they don't have. So it's a good way to really understand at a ground level how the system's operating.
Well, I think too, coming from a mountainous rural area, that having eyes on the runway is pretty significant in a place where I live. That fog can come in pretty quick, like it did last week, and we had to go back around and try again.
Right.
So I would just urge that it's amazing how much better the weather predicting has gotten over the year and how much more accurate. But as we move forward, I think those rural airports need to have that basic attention paid to them.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
agree. Thank you.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Whitaker, I would like to discuss the resiliency of our aviation system, from melting runways in London last year to rising sea levels threatening coastal airports to increased turbulence on flights. Climate change is significantly impacting our aviation system. Mr. Whitaker, do you agree that climate change poses new challenges for airlines, airports, and the FAA?
I do, Senator. I think we saw that last week with New York and LaGuardia runways being flooded, and each airport has its own issues, but I think sometimes it's just a question of improving drainage, but I think we need to look at that resiliency.
Do you agree that all parties in the aviation system need to invest in more resiliency? LaGuardia is a good example. New York City is a good example.
And I think the airlines are investing in sustainable fuel. I think that's part of that equation.
So that's why I've fought hard for two of my bills to address this issue. The first is the Airport Infrastructure Resiliency Act which Senator Sullivan and I filed as an amendment to the FAA reauthorization bill, which would create a new grant program to improve airport resiliency. Senators Fisher, Welsh, Capito, and I have also introduced the Airline Operational Resiliency Act, which requires the Government Accountability Office to investigate airlines' plans for extreme weather events. We need to harden our aviation system against extreme weather events and natural disasters. There is no time to lose. I want to turn to another issue related to airport resiliency, airport service workers. These individuals are the unsung heroes of our aviation system, but they are often overworked and underpaid. Our airports would not function if these essential workers, like baggage handlers, wheelchair attendants, and ramp agents, did not do their jobs. Mr. Whitaker, do you agree that airport service workers are critical to the operation and reliability of our aviation system?
I certainly agree that they are critical to that system.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why with Senator Schumer, I have been fighting to include my Good Jobs for Good Airports Act in the FAA reauthorization bill. The bill would help to ensure that airport service workers are paid a living wage and benefits. It's time that we repay the benefits that these workers deserve. We could see it during the pandemic where they had to go to work. They had to take the risks which others did not have to take. It is absolutely imperative that we have a fairer distribution of the incredible benefits that are flowing to airports increasingly in terms of how it's shared. And that is not happening. And Senator Schumer and Chair Cantwell and I are committed to continuing to work in order to ensure that we can include that in the FAA reauthorization. And I would like to finally turn to aviation safety. Over the past year, we've seen a scary number of near misses between aircraft. In fact, in one instance, 2 planes actually struck each other at Boston's Logan Airport in my home state. Fortunately, the 2 planes were barely moving when their wings clipped each other and no one was injured. But it was yet another reminder about the risk of air travel. So, and I know other members have asked you about it, but I would like you once again just to expand on the prioritization of safety that you will bring to the FAA.
Thank you, Senator. Clearly, safety is the #1 priority. These near misses, these incursions, they come in a number of categories. And I think what we need to do is really drive the most serious ones down to a level of 0. That's not been the case before, but that needs to be our target.
Yeah, when I was a boy, my Aunt Mary would travel around the world and would go to Logan Airport. And my brothers and I would be taken by her over to a machine where she would buy an insurance policy on her life.
I remember those
fly
machines.
out of Logan Airport and then hand us the insurance policy on her life, which, of course, as we were kissing her goodbye, left us with mixed emotions about what is about to happen to our Aunt Mary. And we've come a long way from that
Yes, we
at
have.
the airport. But still, there are families that justifiably are concerned about their safety, given the incidents now in airport after airport across the country.
Yep.
Thank you for your good work. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Seeing none of my colleagues on the other side are on the screen, we'll go back to keep on this side. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Whitaker, thank you so much for your willingness to return to public service at this critical moment for the FAA. I wanted to ask you about the agency's ongoing efforts to support airports in their transition away from firefighting foams that contain PFAS. I will say that the issue facing so many of my communities in Wisconsin, where public wells or municipal wells near airports have led to PFAS contamination in the drinking water systems, has cost them millions of dollars in both short-term and long-term remediation efforts. In early May, I sent a bipartisan letter with several of my colleagues on the committee to the FAA asking that the agency complete its transition plan by early May. And I'm encouraged to note that that transition plan was completed, and the very first PFAS-free foam was approved by the FAA last month. However, many airports throughout Wisconsin continue to have questions about transition and are anxious for additional guidance and clarity from the agency. We've fielded a number of questions and forwarded them to the agency. So will you commit to ensuring that this transition is a top priority for the agency and the FAA is responsive to airports that have any questions and need guidance?
Yes, Senator, I will. This is a new issue for me. I've come to learn about it in recent weeks, but I understand the FAA is working closely with DOD to have an appropriate transition, and we will make sure that that continues.
I appreciate that. Another topic. Earlier this year, I worked with my colleague, Senator Sullivan, to introduce bipartisan legislation called the Flight Education Access Act. This would ensure the pilot profession is accessible to more people by raising the amount of federal student loans available. It's a more costly educational program. This was one of the top recommendations of the Women in Aviation Advisory Board's final report, and I'm encouraged by the strong support we've received for the legislation, including from a wide-ranging groups of airlines and pilot unions. Given your leadership in aviation, including at the FAA and at a major airline, do you believe that additional financial tools like student loans may help more people enter the aviation workforce?
I do, and I think that as many initiatives as we can muster to make it easier for enter this profession. It's very expensive to become a pilot. It's an investment akin to becoming a lawyer or a doctor financially. So I think if we want more pilots, we need to make that pathway more affordable.
Thank you. One final question. I've been working closely with Aviation Subcommittee Chair Duckworth for years on access to air travel for individuals with disabilities. In the last FAA reauthorization bill, we made progress on the issue, and we are hopeful that the reauthorization bill we are working on now will continue to make meaningful change in this arena. Mr. Whitaker, I'm interested in your thoughts about how FAA can continue to break down barriers for individuals with disabilities, and if confirmed, will you commit to making this a top priority?
I will make it a top priority. I think by all means, there's every reason to make sure we move as aggressively as possible in that space.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lujan.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I believe that Senator Hickenlooper is going to be next.
I'm more than happy to call on Senator Hickenlooper.
I apologize and appreciate the support of my peers. I have to go preside, and we don't want the wheels of democracy to grind to a halt. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for your visit last week. Thank you for your willingness to serve. Communities in and around Centennial, Colorado, across our state have to consistently deal with excessive noise from low-flying aircraft, getting worse and worse. We're working to ensure a long-term authorization bill for the FAA gives communities a seat at the table to resolve noise-related concerns and have their concerns heard. If you're confirmed, will you work with us to ensure communities are properly heard and responded to when dealing with concerns of aircraft noise?
Thank you, Senator. I certainly would, and I think engagement with the community in this circumstance is crucial and can often result in understandings about operational limitations that can alleviate some of that noise. So I think that's a great initiative.
Great, perfect. Also, a big deal in Colorado is regional air service. It's a lifeline in many cases to rural communities all around our state and around the country, a big part of their economic development. In Colorado, some of our rural communities, such as Grand Junction and Cortez, have suffered dramatic reductions in air service over the last few years. We also need to strengthen the Essential Air Service, the EAS program, which you know, to ensure airlines honor the contracts that they sign with these rural areas. If you're confirmed, what improvements would you make to the EAS program to improve, what improvements would you make to improve its long-term reliability?
So for the FAA, the role that we can play really is to make sure the airports have the proper infrastructure, the proper safety technology. The EAS program itself is administered, of course, out of the DOT, but we can support DOT on that by having adequate airports, and I think also encouraging new technology that might be available for those new technology, new forms of flight, electric eVTOL flights that I think are a service option for some of those locations, so we can help facilitate their entry into service.
Great. Last question. Obviously, fighting climate change has become one of the greatest challenges we face. Cleaner aviation fuels, more efficient technologies are going to be able to reduce carbon and pollution coming out of the aviation sector. We've heard a lot of Coloradans come through our office talking about the impact of leaded aviation fuels on their public health, and their air quality. We need to ensure that new types of aviation fuels and technologies are widely available and affordable, especially for regional airports, before we make their consumption a requirement, is my perspective on this. If confirmed, how would you strike a balance between incentivizing and recognizing how important it is to use more efficient aviation fuels and technologies, but also ensuring that they're widely available for the entire aviation sector?
Thank you, Senator. I know this is an issue that the FAA and industry, GA industry, have worked on for many years, and that there's a plan to try to make that transition by 2030. So I think we need to continue to engage with GA, with airports, to make sure we make that transition, but also don't interrupt flight training, for example. So I think it's going to involve a lot of collaboration to deliver that.
Right, and I sense that urgency in your voice, which is what I wanted to hear, and I appreciate that. I yield back the floor, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being here today and for accepting the responsibility as the representative laid out with coming forward to serve. Senator Welch also said something along those lines. So thank you for accepting that responsibility.
Thank you.
Now, as you know, I'm from New Mexico, and New Mexico is known for many, many beautiful landscapes and our mountains and our weather, our sunrises, our incredible airspace, which we protect. But in the next few weeks, we're going to be celebrating the International Balloon Fiesta, which is the largest hot air balloon gathering in the world.
Wow.
And there comes responsibilities to the FAA pursuant to the International Balloon Fiesta. And I've been proud to work with many of the balloonist community in this particular space, Mr. Whitaker, to ensure that the FAA would not bar Albuquerque balloon operators from flying in the city's Class C airspace. However, as new technologies emerge, I know that these issues will continue to come up as the FAA works to keep our airspace safe. My question to you, Mr. Whitaker, is if confirmed, do you pledge to keep in mind the unique needs and limitations facing hot air balloon operators as you roll out regulations related to new technologies and airspace access?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's an interesting question. We've talked a lot about new entrants into the airspace. That's a very old entrant, I think, in the airspace. So I think that one of the key principles for the new entrants is that the existing services can operate efficiently and unimpeded by the new entrants. So I would categorize balloons as part of that. So yes, I can give you that commitment.
I appreciate that. And if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that the FAA needs strong leadership. After a winter and summer travel season rife with delays, technological disruptions, staffing issues, it's time that we confirm an FAA administrator to get our aviation system back on track. Now, one part of the aviation system that needs immediate attention is air traffic control, Mr. Whitaker, as you know. Right now, there are shortages in staffing across the country, forcing our controllers to work intense schedules with long and longer hours. When we do not take good care of our air traffic controllers, it puts the efficiency and safety of our aviation system at risk. Fortunately, there are some actions we can take together to improve the health of our air traffic control systems. Now, Mr. Whitaker, yes or no, do you support efforts to ensure the FAA is hiring and training as many controllers as are needed each year to address existing shortages?
Yes, sir, that will be a top priority.
Mr. Whitaker, yes or no, do you support efforts to fix the way we calculate the number of air traffic controllers that our aviation system needs? This would mean counting those currently in training separately from fully trained controllers.
I can commit to look into that issue. That's not an issue that I'm familiar with, but I will certainly look into it.
I appreciate that. If we don't set the right targets for how many staff are at our air traffic control systems, it concerns me that we will not fix the problem. I'll follow up with you in writing to make sure we continue to work closely in this space and to fully express why it's important.
Right.
Now, Mr. Whitaker, the Albuquerque Air Traffic Control Center staffing numbers have consistently been below targets for years. What can we do to address staffing challenges, especially at the centers that are struggling the most?
I think that that is a common issue and an outcome of the shortage generally that we have. So I think the most important thing is to really focus on expanding that pipeline and getting as many potential controllers into the system and training them as we can.
I appreciate that. And lastly, Mr. Whitaker, diversity matters to me as we work to establish a strong workforce in every aspect of the federal government as well. And that's a space that I look forward to working with you on and working with colleagues as well to raise issues all across the country, but to ensure that we have the strongest teams available, possible, trained, ready to go, and especially with retirement eligibility as well, that we pay close attention to many of these factors that need desperate attention just to keep us safe. So I appreciate that very much. And Chair Cantwell, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome. I heard TWA as a St. Louis guy. It's like a long-lost ghost. TWA used to dominate, and I grew up by the airport in St. Louis. So.
And I spent a lot of time in that airport back in the day. Yeah.
I want to start by just noting that since Joe Biden took office, we've had pilot shortages, air traffic controller shortages, widespread daily delays, the first nationwide ground stop since 9/11, and near misses at major airports throughout the country. This administration, the Biden administration, has taken its eye off the ball, and it's been a mess. Instead of focusing on thoughtful deregulation and incentivizing policies to promote technological innovation and improving safety, this administration has been focused on superfluous changes such as changing the name of the NOTAM system from notices to airmen to notices to air mission, and spending millions on climate change, racial equity, and environmental justice. Like many in the room and many of my constituents, I travel on a weekly basis, and I can tell you the last thing that I care about 30,000 feet in the air is virtue signaling. I can tell you that most Missourians feel the same way. All they want is to get home the quickest and safest way possible so they can get back to their families and put their kids to bed. Unfortunately, I've heard more about DEI and radical climate agenda from this administration when it comes to their priority list for the FAA than I have about safety. Mr. Whitaker, that said, I will say that it's refreshing to not see a single mention of the words diversity, equity, inclusion, or climate change in your testimony. That's at least progress over the last nominee for the FAA we had just a few months ago. I want to read for you the FAA's mission statement provided on the agency's website for you. Our continuing mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. Mr. Whitaker, do you agree that the FAA's primary mission should be to provide for the safety and efficiency of America's national airspace system?
I do agree that that is the mission of the FAA, yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Whitaker, we've heard incessantly from this administration about its blind obsession to promoting DEI. One of the worst actors would indeed be your boss, potential boss, Secretary Buttigieg. In fact, at the end of August, Secretary Buttigieg announced 24 members to his Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity to help implement, quote, an equity action plan across the Department of Transportation, including the FAA. Mr. Whitaker, if confirmed as FAA Administrator, will you prioritize promoting practices to institutionalize equity over safety of America's flying public?
If I'm confirmed as Administrator, my number one priority will be safety, always.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. And lastly, your experience, I think, speaks for itself, and I'm not here to question your expertise. However, this administration has clearly lost sight of what really matters when it comes to the aviation sector. If your nomination is successful, I hope that you will hold true to your commitments today and we need a sense of urgency in promoting that kind of innovation, safety, and addressing workforce shortages, as opposed to this radical agenda that this administration has put forth that has nothing to do with any of those things. And I look forward to continuing those conversations if you're confirmed. Thank you.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really appreciate you holding the nomination hearing today. And Mr. Whitaker, thank you again, like everyone has stated, your willingness to serve. And I look forward to today's discussion. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's impacting us in Nevada, which is airport obstruction. And we need some analysis on that, because the safety of passengers and crew, it's the most important part of airport operations. And of course, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, Harry Reid International Airport really is at one end of the Las Vegas Strip with so many hotels right next door. Last year in 2022, we saw a record 52 million visitors through there. But our airport, like many others across the country, has been left unable to raise critical safety and security concerns about nearby obstructions through the FAA's current obstruction evaluation airport airspace analysis process. We must ensure that this process is robust, that it involves all stakeholder input, and in particular takes into account the safety and security and the concerns of the airport seriously. So, Mr. Whitaker, I know when we met ahead of this hearing, I spoke with you about the need to consider more of a cumulative impact during the OEAAA process. And if confirmed, how will you ensure that this process is sufficient to account for major concerns, as our Las Vegas Strip is right there at the end of the runways, and all the ground safety that is, just the safety concerns in general raised by the TSA?
Thank you, Senator. And I'm glad we had a chance to talk about this issue a couple weeks ago. I think that the processes that the FAA runs are designed to be standard across the board, but we do run into circumstances where we need to consider special geographies or special characteristics. Our focus is on safety. Security is a somewhat different bucket, but I think it's a valid issue that you're raising, and given the geography of the airport and the proximity to the high rises in that area. So I think we can look at taking a more holistic look at that analysis.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And on that note, we have a large stadium right there off the Las Vegas Strip. We're going to be home to next year's Super Bowl. We're very proud of that. But of course, there are stadiums all across the country. And since the September 11 terrorist attacks, Congress and the executive branch have recognized the need to protect stadiums and large sporting events. We have a F1 race coming up around Formula One around Thanksgiving. Like I said, it's home to the Las Vegas Raiders. We have the Super Bowl, NFL draft. We are really emerging as a sports capital in the nation. And so this makes Las Vegas a very rich target environment for bad actors. And the FAA initially imposed temporary flight restrictions over stadium events, including for drones, and Congress subsequently strengthened and codified these requirements. However, sports leagues have reported an increase in violations of flight restrictions, particularly by drones. So again, Mr. Whitaker, if you're confirmed, will you commit to working with my office to ensure that federal policy continues these longstanding protections for stadiums and ensure that the federal government is nimble as we face these evolving threats like drones?
Yes, Senator, I can give you that commitment, and we will work with the appropriate law enforcement agencies to cooperate in that endeavor.
Thank you. And finally, I'm going to just move on a little bit to cyber attacks because, again, we are no stranger to when that happens. And the NOTAM system outage in January, it really made clear to all Americans how dependent the world's largest economy is on air travel. And so how dependent we are, how antiquated our computer system is, and just so many things laid bare, obviously, in January. So while the incident spanning January 10th and 11th was determined not to be the result of a cyber attack, it did, again, really reveal the vulnerabilities at the FAA's NOTAM system security, its architecture, and it does raise significant cybersecurity concerns that we must be proactive about. So can you talk about the FAA's cybersecurity capabilities and how you would plan to improve in this space to prevent an attack?
Thank you, Senator. My knowledge on the cybersecurity is about 7 years out of date. If I'm confirmed and I'm back in the secure realm there, I'll be able to evaluate that more closely. But it's typically a very comprehensive cross-agency approach to identifying threats and mitigating those threats.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Whitaker, congratulations.
Thanks,
on
sir.
your nomination. I appreciated our extensive discussion last week on a lot of issues, national issues, but I want to dig into the Alaska issues that we talked about. As you and I discussed, over 80% of the communities in my state are only accessible by air or boat if they're on a river, or a snow machine. They're not connected by roads. And you know, we work really well with the FAA, but there's this kind of one-size-fits-all approach from federal agencies. A lot of times it just doesn't work in Alaska. And as you and I talked about, there's a lot of issues where we're trying to get the FAA to be a little bit more flexible, not to cut corners, but to actually increase safety. So I want to just review a few of these. You know, there are the issues of weather observation and infrastructure that a lot of times the FAA comes like, well, it's kind of expensive. Well, you know, give us roads to our communities and it wouldn't be that expensive, right? So we feel like sometimes we're an afterthought. And the problem is that more people die and there are more crashes in my state relating to aviation than any other state by far. So you and I talked about that. I just want to submit for the record, Madam Chair, the February 2020 NTSB report that looked at a 10-year period of accident rates in Alaska that was almost 2.4 times higher, that's with an X, than the rest of the country, and the fatal accident rate is almost 1.4 times higher than the rest of the country. I'm sure you would agree that that's unacceptable.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I do agree, sir. I appreciate the conversation we were able to have, and I've had a chance to visit a lot of the aviation facilities in Alaska, and I do recognize the importance of having a bespoke system in place to mitigate some of those risks.
So let me just try to walk through a couple of the commitments that you and I talked about. I think the first one's really easy. The FAA Alaska Aviation Safety Initiative, FASI as we're calling it, was an attempt to try to address these, you know, highest crash and death rates in the country. Will you commit to me and this committee to keep the FAA's leadership on that? There's been some good work in that regard, but a lot more needs to happen in that with regard to keeping this FASI initiative going.
Yes, sir, I will.
And in particular, I want to, as you and I discussed, the issue of weather observation, the reliability of weather equipment. It's kind of crazy that when it goes down in, say, a remote community, then you don't have pilots who can see what the weather is. And the inflexibility of the FAA to enable people on the ground to go fix that equipment, as you and I talked about, sometimes it'll be down for months because the regs say, well, someone from Washington, D.C. has got to fly 5,000 miles to Alaska to fix the weather observation equipment in a small remote village in Alaska, and so you don't have weather observation. Can you commit to me to work with me and this committee to fix those kind of regulations? Again, we're trying to get more safety, not less safety, and some of the inflexible FAA regs prevent us from doing that.
Yes, sir, I will. I'll make that commitment, yes.
Your predecessor's first, just a month on the job, met with the Alaska air carriers. You and I talked about that. Will you commit to coming to Alaska soon in your tenure, if confirmed, to meet with our air carriers, our aviation community, and get firsthand from them some of the big challenges that we're working on?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to.
And then, as I mentioned, with regard to FASI, would you work with this committee and me to make sure that, again, that's part of the FAA budget? One of the things that we get frustrated on, and by the way, the FAA reauth that we're working on right now has a lot of good stuff in it as it relates to infrastructure, weather observation. It was very bipartisan. Most people realize, geez, you guys have this real challenge in Alaska, Dan, with infrastructure, weather reporting. The rest of the lower 48 doesn't have that, so of course we'll help you. So it's been very bipartisan.
But can I get your commitment, particularly when it relates to budget issues, to work with us on those kind of FOSI infrastructure and weather observation reporting issues?
Yes, sir, you can.
And then finally, I wanted to just revisit the discussion we had on the ARNP issue. I have a letter, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record from the Alaska Air Carriers Association requesting assistance to retract, amend, and reissue the guidance that we talked about with regard to the FAA and the approved instrument approach procedures. Again, this is a community that's trying to get to more safety, not less. Will you take a hard look at that if confirmed to retract or amend or at least suspend that guidance until people have a better understanding of how that's negatively impacting Alaska? I don't think that was FAA's intention.
I certainly will look at it.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chair Cantwell. My colleagues on this committee may be tired of hearing me say it, and I may be a little bit biased, but I believe that Georgia is this country's most important aviation state. We're home to the world's busiest. I appreciate all the amens in the. Georgia's home to the world's busiest airport in Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the headquarters of Delta Airlines, and over 100 public use airports across the state. According to the Georgia Department of Economic Development, aerospace products are both the state's top export and its second largest manufacturing industry, responsible for $57 billion in annual economic impact. Most importantly, Georgia's aviation industry employs more than 108,000 people across more than 800 different companies. That said, like many industries, aviation faces a widespread workforce shortage, affecting both commercial aviation and the FAA's air traffic controlling staffing, which should concern all of us. Mr. Whitaker, how do we meet this moment and build a more sustainable, representative, and resilient aviation workforce?
Thank you, Senator. I think building the workforce pipeline for the aviation industry is a key priority, starting with the controller workforce, but also in piloting, mechanics, other professions. These are all good professions. We need to cast as wide a net as we can, and we need to build a pipeline of folks coming through to take these jobs. So it is a priority.
I agree with you, and I want to zero in on that phrase that you just said. You said we need to cast a net as wide as we can, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I believe that the best way to foster a well-trained aviation workforce is to invest in aviation education. I think often about a young man that I met down in Georgia a few months ago. His last name escapes me, but Ezekiel was his first name. And he had that light in his eye that you like to see in a young person. He had found that passion, that thing that you wake up in the morning wanting to do. He wanted to be a pilot. And he was very well qualified, was making progress. But years into trying to become a pilot and thousands of dollars of his own money trying to meet the requirements, he was still struggling to get there. And it's entirely too hard for too many of our young people. And he had this kind of persistence and passion that not everybody has. And so that's why I was proud to introduce the Airways Act earlier this year, and why I'm working with my colleagues to expand the FAA's workforce development grant programs in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2023. It's also my belief that once authorized, these grants should help more schools, including state and technical colleges, train students from rural and non-traditional communities to work in the aviation industry, all at a reasonable cost. We need all of our talent, all of our brilliance of all of our young people, regardless of their zip code. If confirmed, will you commit to working with me to ensure that the FAA's Workforce Development Grant Program reaches students who don't typically enter the aviation field, whether they're mechanics or pilots or aviation engineers?
I can, Senator, and I feel part of my job would be to be the chief recruiting officer for the FAA, but also for the industry, making FAA an employer of choice, so I would welcome that role.
Thank you so very much, and I look forward to working with you on this issue. On another matter, this past weekend, Congress narrowly avoided a government shutdown. I commend my colleagues who supported this bipartisan funding bill, though I fear that we may find ourselves right back here in just a few short weeks. A reckless government shutdown would hurt countless Georgians, including the over 1,700 local TSA agents and almost 600 air traffic controllers in Georgia who would be required to work without pay during a shutdown. Mr. Whitaker, you may find yourself in the unenviable position of being confirmed as FAA administrator and immediately facing the prospect of a government shutdown. How would a government shutdown, in your opinion, affect the FAA? And if tasked with shepherding the FAA through a government shutdown, how will you lead the agency through this manufactured chaos?
Well, Senator, if it does happen, it won't be the first time it's happened, because it happened when I was there before. I think the biggest impact that I would point out would be on the training of controllers. That would come to a stop. And controllers who are in the training program would no longer be in the tower. So I think that's not the result we would want in this situation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Senator Vance.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for being here and for being willing to serve. I appreciate our conversation yesterday, and I appreciate you coming in today. One of the things that I worry about, not just at the FAA, but it's sort of the government administration more broadly, is that we focus on sort of bizarre questions of identification and language rather than the very real problems that you guys have to confront, you guys have to address. My colleagues on the Democratic side typically want government to be a little bit maybe bigger or more aggressive than we do on our side. But I think pretty much all of us think that we want an FAA that is good at its job and prevents airlines and airplanes from crashing, one of the most important functions that exists in our government, and I want it done well. So let me just sort of ask that with that sort of setup in mind. I've been a little bit worried about the focus on non-gendered language that exists in some of the FAA manuals and recent trainings. Just to give you an example, the FAA recently hosted a, quote, inclusivity summit where the spokeswoman stated, quote, aerospace is for everyone and the language we use matters. We launched an agency-wide initiative to adopt gender-neutral and inclusive aviation terminology. Now, as an example of some of this, which I struggle not to laugh, the FAA has decided that it should stop using airman, it should start using pilot, and it should stop saying unmanned, it should start saying uncrewed, and I guess generally the word cockpit is offensive, and so should stop being used in the Federal Aviation Administration. And I'm just curious, Mr. Whitaker, you seem like a very serious guy. Do you believe that the FAA should be focused on eliminating all references to gender-specific language like the ones I just mentioned?
Thank you, Senator. I guess I would start by saying that the primary mission at FAA is going to be safety. Sure. And that will always be the top priority. I do think language evolves. We went from stewardesses to flight attendants, and it doesn't strike me as necessarily out of the ordinary to do that. But again, my focus is going to be on safety and running the agency effectively.
I understand that, and I understand that language does sometimes evolve. I guess the concern that I have, if I'm looking at this from the perspective of my constituents in the state of Ohio, they see a government agency that has an important function. Instead of focusing on that important function, it's focused on things like changing unmanned to uncrewed. It just seems a little unserious. I think I speak for a lot of people in the state of Ohio when I would say that I just want a lot of our government agencies to be a little bit less weird and a little bit more focused on the mission, and I hope you will take a similar approach. One way in which I think this is a particularly acute problem in the aviation industry, and you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, is traveling by air has become more and more miserable, it seems, over the past couple of years. It's because airlines are a little bit too unstaffed. It's because of some of the pent-up demand, the latent demand from the COVID era. But one thing that I've become aware of just in the last few months is that apparently
travel times between certain major American cities has actually gone up over the last 50 years. We have this sense in America that we're on this pathway to sort of technological progress. It marches on and on and on. But apparently 50 years ago, it took less time to fly from New York to Houston than it does today. That seems kind of weird, right? Like why in an era of technological progress is it taking us longer to travel from one place to another? That seems to indict the aviation industry or the people who regulate the aviation industry or somebody who's involved in the aviation industry. And so I just encourage you to be focused on as many of the real problems instead of the fake problems. I think it will build trust in your agency if you're able to do that. Let me just ask this final question. I mean, do you think it's fair that we're dealing with a labor shortage in the aviation industry, whether it's flight crews, pilots, or ground staff?
Well, I think there are different causal factors for those situations. I think for pilots, for example, for many decades, it was not a particularly well-paid profession, particularly at the entry level. And it became well-paid at the very end of your career, but you started at a very low salary. So I think we've seen those salaries go up pretty significantly over the past few years. So the market, I think, is working fine. A lot more people are being attracted to that profession. I put that in a different category than the controller shortage, which is really a pipeline issue for hiring at FAA that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I understand. And recognizing my time is low here, I just asked Mr. Whitaker, to the extent possible, I'd ask you to be as focused as much as you can on the actual administration, on the real problems, on the safety challenges, and not on these sort of weird language priorities. Again, I think it erodes confidence in federal agencies. I also think it's a huge distraction. Thank you for being here.
Senator Young.
I thank our chair. Mr. Whitaker, congratulations on your nomination to this important position. I really appreciate it. And before I dive into a series of questions, just one threshold question. Would you commit to visit with Indiana's aviation stakeholders should you be confirmed?
Absolutely, sir.
All right, thank you. It's really important, as someone who's spent a lot of time focusing on innovation during my Senate term, that the approach you take to this job lends itself to continued aviation. And I know from your background, you've recently focused quite a bit on emerging technologies. Your previous experience at FAA suggests that. So when balancing innovation on one hand and security on the other, they're really not two sides of a coin. I think oftentimes innovations lead to increased safety, which is rightly your top priority. But I'd kind of like to unpack this topic and with you. So if confirmed, maybe you can tell me how you'd ensure that the FAA continues to prioritize safety, but doesn't unnecessarily stifle innovation.
Thank you, Senator. I think that's the balance that we have to strike, and I think we view it as primarily safeguarding existing operations to make sure that as new entrants come in, they're not interfering with particularly the very busy airspace that we operate now. So the goal is integration, not creating separate spaces for folks to operate, and that's going to take really fundamentally revising how we design the airspace and what we can accommodate, and it's going to take some time. But I think we need to really develop a sort of a master vision for what that looks like and what technologies are needed and how we're going to deploy those technologies.
Well, that could really be, one of the hallmarks of your tenure is to get that right. Maybe you can speak to the importance of embarking down that path. Discuss some of the upside of these emerging technologies that you'd like to incorporate into our airspace. Drones, hydrogen, electric propulsion, advanced air mobility. There may be others.
And I think those are good examples, and we're really following what the industry is doing and trying to understand at what pace they're going to come into the system. I think the FAA's role is to try to safely create an opportunity for those technologies to be proven out so that they can be incorporated into the airspace. But there's huge opportunity in all those things for really transforming travel and changing, potentially changing the structure of aviation by opening up new markets that previously couldn't be served because it was unaffordable.
So you're interviewing today to be our nation's head safety regulator, but this is an even bigger job than the title suggests. The FAA also has an important role leading international civil aviation community on aviation regulation safety issues. And we have to maintain the FAA's global leadership in aviation. Do you believe we're currently the global leader in aviation?
I think historically we have been. I think the last few years have put that somewhat in question.
And you're specifically referring to what?
To the MAX crashes.
Yeah. Are you concerned that we don't currently have a U.S. ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization and have not had one since June of 2022?
I think it's important to fill that role. I think the ICAO organization is an excellent organization, one that we should work with closely to drive safety globally.
Do you believe that this gap in leadership is hurting our ability to maintain global leadership in aviation?
I will work to reassert that leadership regardless of where that position is filled. I don't have a specific view on sort of recent months in that regard.
The FAA has still not begun a rulemaking on beyond visual line of sight drone flights to allow for a safe and predictable process that will ensure the U.S. remains globally competitive. If confirmed, will you commit to ensuring this happens in short order?
It will be a top priority, yes.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to say to me in my remaining 13 seconds?
Thank you for your thoughtful questions, sir.
All right, sir. I yield back.
Well, I'll use your 13 seconds. One thing we didn't cover, you're kind of Mr. Next Gen. Could you explain where you think we are, what's been implemented, what advantages that's given us, and what more advantages will it give us in aviation if we get that fully implemented under your watch?
Thank you, Senator. I will, Next Gen is an often misunderstood designation. It is a collection of programs to upgrade the national airspace. We use the analogy of building an iPad, so we've put in an entirely new technology platform that allows us to now move traffic using satellite technology rather than radar, and to communicate with data rather than voice communications for routing. So it's a significant upgrade of the system. The early foundational investments allow us to continue to add new efficiencies into that system, new technologies to make it easier to control traffic. It was originally designed as a 2010 to 2025 program, so 15 years, and it's largely completed. Some of the programs will run beyond that. So Datacom, for example, largely because it was expanded. It was such a popular technology that we've expanded it to additional facilities. So I think it's largely coming to a close, and it's time to really look at what's next for the airspace.
So you would say, in general, to somebody at home who may not quite understand this, we've moved off of radar onto satellite communications.
We have moved from radar to satellite.
And guiding planes in a much more gradual approach,
and I think
saving fuel and cost.
That's right. I think many of us remember the step-down approaches where you would feel a descent and level and a descent and level, and now it's a much more efficient descent where you pull back the power and let the aircraft take its natural path down to the runway, much more fuel efficient and much quieter.
And what do you think that's benefited aviation? How do you think that's benefited aviation?
I think fuel savings is a huge component of that, noise reduction, and block time savings for airlines. So it was a big upfront investment, but it's yielding benefits and will continue to yield benefits.
Well, I think I wanted to close with that just because I think you were at the beginning of a very big transformation, and yet we have more transformation to do. So I think you're the guy with the experience of that next-gen implementation that gives you the depth and breadth of how big a challenge can be, because certainly it was a big challenge moving our country onto a better system. So we'll look forward to that full implementation, because I agree with you. I think it could yield much bigger aviation advantages to the United States if we keep moving forward on this. I think you can see we had a very engaged committee today. I think you can see that this committee cares a lot about aviation. We had, I think, a few people missing, probably because they're dealing with other big thorny problems at the moment, but nearly perfect attendance from everybody and very big engagement. I think I heard the words safety and workforce constantly from everyone. So I think it tells you what we think the priorities are. So again, thank you for your willingness to serve. Before we close the hearing, I have to again ask if you pledge to work collaboratively with the committee, and that means timely responses for requests for information and to address important policy issues and appear before the committee when requested.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Senators will have until the close of business, Monday, October 9th, to submit questions for the record to the committee. The witness will have until the close of business, Monday, October 16th, to respond to those questions, and that concludes our hearing.
Thank you.